I need to check the used names list and then write the story. Names to avoid: Sarah, Chloe, Nicole, Marcus, Jenna, Vivian, Devin, Petra, Elise, Theo, Katerina, Luca, Audrey, Owen, Caleb, Ren, Renata, Brandon, Theodore. I collapsed on a Tuesday. That's the part nobody really talks about. It's never some dramatic moment where you see it coming. There's no warning, no slow fade to black like in the movies. 1 second, I was standing in the break room at the hospital where I work as a billing coordinator, reaching for a paper cup, and the next second, the floor was just there, right in front of my face. I remember thinking the linoleum was dirty. That was my last thought before everything went dark. I was 28 years old. I had been working 60, sometimes 70 hours a week for almost 4 years straight. 2 jobs for the first 2 of those years, the billing office during the day, a restaurant 3 nights a week and Saturdays. I dropped the restaurant job 8 months before I collapsed, not because things got better, but because I physically couldn't do it anymore. My hands had started shaking during my shift, and a coworker asked if I was okay, and I burst into tears in the middle of a Friday dinner rush, which is not exactly a high point in anyone's personal history. But I kept the billing job. Of course I kept it. I didn't have a choice. Here's what my life looked like at 28. I paid my rent. I paid my mother's electric bill, which had been in my name since I was 23 because hers got shut off and she called me crying. I paid my stepfather's truck insurance. His name is Garrett, and I will tell you more about Garrett shortly, none of it flattering. I paid the monthly subscription on whatever streaming services my younger brother Flynn wanted that month because he would text me the login wasn't working and it was easier to just fix it than to explain to him that I couldn't afford it. I bought my own groceries. I split my own prescriptions in half to make them last longer because I was on a medication that cost $90 a month after insurance, and some months that $90 was the difference between covering everything and not covering everything. Flynn is 4 years younger than me. He surfs. That's the whole career plan. Surfing. He's been working on going pro since he was 19. He is now 24. He has never once held a job longer than 3 months because jobs interfere with training, apparently. My mother thinks this is reasonable. My mother thinks Flynn is going to be on the professional circuit any day now. She's been thinking this for 5 years. My mother's name is Diane. She's been married to Garrett for 11 years. Garrett sells used cars and is very loud at family gatherings and once told me at Thanksgiving that I was too serious and needed to learn how to have fun. This was the same Thanksgiving where I paid for the turkey, the sides, and 2 bottles of wine. Because my mother had called me the week before saying she was short, Garrett did not offer to chip in for any of it. He did, however, eat 3 plates. I'm not saying all of this to sound bitter, I'm saying it because you need to understand the math of my life before I got to that break room floor. I need you to understand that the collapse didn't come from nowhere. It came from 4 years of carrying something that was never supposed to be mine to carry, and my body finally just put it down, without asking me first. I woke up in the ICU. I didn't know it was the ICU at first. I knew there were a lot of machines and that the lights were very bright and that my throat hurt in a way that told me something had been down it recently. A nurse came in within about 2 minutes of me opening my eyes, and she was very calm and very kind, and she explained that I had been brought in the previous evening, so I'd been out for almost 18 hours, and that I'd collapsed from a combination of severe dehydration, exhaustion, and what they were calling a stress-induced cardiac event, which is a very clinical way of saying my heart had done something alarming enough to land me in intensive care. I was 30. Actually, no, I was 28. I keep wanting to make myself older in this story. I don't know why. Maybe because 28 feels too young to have a cardiac event from being too tired. Maybe because if I was older, it would make more sense. But I was 28, and my heart had misbehaved badly enough that they put me on a monitor, and I was in the ICU, and when I asked the nurse if anyone had called my family, she smiled in a way that was very careful and said yes, they'd reached my emergency contact. My emergency contact was my mother. She didn't come. I found that out slowly, over the first day. Nobody said it directly. The nurses were professional about it, which I appreciated and also found quietly devastating. But there was no one in my room. There was no one in the waiting area asking about me. I thought to ask eventually when I felt human enough to be curious. The floor coordinator checked and said there was nobody waiting. I thought maybe they'd come earlier when I was unconscious. I thought maybe they were on their way. I thought a lot of things that turned out not to be true. On day 2, my mother called. Not visited, called. She asked how I was doing in a voice that sounded like she was checking an item off a list, and then she told me that she, Garrett, and Flynn were actually already in Arizona. They'd driven out the day before, the same day I'd collapsed, for a surfing competition that Flynn had qualified for near the coast. Not Arizona, actually. She said it was a competition in Southern California near San Diego, and they were driving down the coast after. A little trip. She said it like that. A little trip. I didn't say anything for a moment. I was in the ICU. I had leads on my chest. I was on a heart monitor. Mom, I said, I'm in intensive care. I know, honey, she said. But the doctors are taking care of you, right? And Flynn has been waiting for this qualifying event for months. We couldn't just not go. I want to be accurate about this next part because I've told this story to a few people and sometimes I'm tempted to make my response more dramatic than it was. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I think I was too exhausted for either of those things. I just said, okay, and I said I'd talk to her later, and I hung up. And then I lay there in the ICU bed, and I stared at the ceiling tiles, and I counted them, 42 tiles. I counted them 3 times to make sure. Here's the thing I didn't know. Here's the part of this story that I didn't find out until much later. And when I did, it rearranged something inside me in a way I'm still not entirely sure how to describe. Someone came every night. I found out because on night 4, I was still awake at around 11:30. Hospitals are not great places for sleeping, it turns out, and I heard the door to my room open very quietly. I thought it was a nurse coming to check vitals, but the person who came in wasn't in scrubs. He was older, maybe 60 or so, with gray at his temples and the kind of posture that comes from years of physical work. He was carrying a paper bag from a diner down the street. He stopped when he saw my eyes open. I didn't mean to wake you, he said. I stared at him. I had absolutely no idea who he was. I'm sorry, I said. I think you might have the wrong room. He looked at the number on the door, then back at me. He said my name, my full name, like a question. I said yes. He sat down in the chair by the door slowly, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to. He said, my name is Ray. I knew your mother a long time ago. Before Garrett, before all of it. And then he sat there and I looked at him and something in my chest that had nothing to do with the cardiac event did something strange and quiet. Ray had brought soup. He set the bag on the tray table and said I didn't have to eat it if I didn't want to, but he'd noticed he'd asked the nurses, he explained, and they'd told him what they could, that I hadn't had much appetite. He'd read somewhere that hospital food was hard to eat when you were anxious. He said this very matter-of-factly, like bringing soup to a stranger in the ICU was the most normal thing in the world. I ate the soup. It was from a Greek diner 2 blocks from the hospital, and it was the best thing I'd tasted in 4 days, which maybe wasn't saying much, but felt like it was saying everything. We talked for about an hour. He told me that he and my mother had been together in their late 20s, before she met Garrett, before a lot of things. He didn't say it directly that night. He was careful, circumspect, the kind of man who chooses his words like he's paying for them. But he said that he had kept track of me over the years. Not in a strange way, he was quick to add, just in the way that sometimes people need to know that someone they care about is okay, even if they're not in the picture. I asked him how he'd known I was in the hospital. He said a coworker of mine had posted something on social media, one of those vague, please send good thoughts to a friend posts, and he'd seen it and he'd figured out the rest from there. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said, you've been here every night. He said yes. He said he sat outside, mostly in the waiting area, because he didn't want to intrude. He'd only come in that night because he'd seen the light under my door and thought I might be awake and lonely. I was both of those things. I had been both of those things for 4 days. Ray came back the next night and the night after that. He didn't stay long, an hour, maybe 2. He brought different things from the diner each time, soup one night, then a sandwich, then a slice of pie that was aggressively mediocre, but that I ate every bite of. He told me stories about the neighborhood he'd grown up in, about a job he'd had decades ago restoring old furniture, about a dog he'd owned named Pepper who had opinions about mail carriers. He asked me questions about my work, about what I liked, about what I wanted for myself. Not in a pushy way, in the way of someone who genuinely wants to know. On the 6th night, I asked him directly, "Ray," I said, "what are you to me exactly?" He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands. Then he said, "That's something your mother should have told you a long time ago, and I'm sorry she didn't." He didn't say more than that, not that night, but he didn't have to. I'd done the math in the quiet of 4 days in an ICU bed with nothing to do but think and stare at 42 ceiling tiles. My mother's reaction to my emergency contact, the way she'd said Garrett's name my entire life like he was the only man who mattered, the careful distance she'd always maintained between me and any mention of the years before Garrett. The way she'd never, not once, told me anything concrete about my father beyond he wasn't in the picture. I had spent 28 years not asking the right questions. I was starting to understand that wasn't an accident. I was in the hospital for 9 days total. On day 8, my mother came back. She didn't call ahead. She just appeared, which I should have anticipated because Diane has a talent for arriving in the middle of things and immediately making those things about herself. She came in with a vase of flowers, purple tulips, which I'm allergic to, a fact she has known for years, and she set them on the windowsill and she looked at the monitors and she said, "See, you're doing so much better." I said, "Hi, Mom." She sat down and launched into a summary of the California trip. Flynn had placed 3rd in his age category. The coast was beautiful. They'd eaten at a seafood place that was just wonderful. She said all of this with the energy of someone who had done a good thing and wanted credit for it, which I had long since learned was just how she moved through the world. I let her talk. I was very calm. I had had 9 days to arrange my thoughts, and I had arranged them thoroughly. When she paused, I said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "Of course, honey." I said, "Who is Ray?" The room went very quiet. Not dramatic movie quiet, just the ambient hum of hospital machines and the distant sound of a cart in the hallway. My mother's face did something complicated. The flower buying, trip summarizing, everything is fine energy dropped away, and underneath it was something I didn't have a name for. She said, "Where did you hear that name?" I said, "He's been here every night, while you were in California." She stood up. She said that was not possible. She said Ray had no business being anywhere near me. She said a lot of things very quickly that didn't add up to an explanation. I watched her and I stayed calm, and I thought about 42 ceiling tiles and I waited. A nurse came in to check my vitals. My mother was pacing by the window. The nurse looked between us with the practiced neutrality of someone who has seen a lot of family situations in hospital rooms and has made a professional decision not to engage. When the nurse left, I said, "Mom, just tell me." She sat back down. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He was someone I knew before Garrett. It didn't work out. He wasn't the right fit for our family." "For our family," I repeated. She looked at the flowers. "Is he my father?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. That was its own kind of answer. "It's complicated," she finally said. "It's really not," I said. "Either he is or he isn't." She started talking about how things had been difficult back then, how she and Ray had wanted different things, how Garrett had come along and it had just made more sense, how she'd thought it was better this way, cleaner, easier. For me, she said, she'd done it for me, so I wouldn't grow up confused, she said, so I'd have a stable home. I thought about the truck insurance, the electric bill, the Thanksgiving turkey. I thought about 60-hour weeks and split pills and a body that had finally quit without asking me first. A stable home, I said. She heard something in my voice. She reached for my hand. I let her take it because I was still in a hospital bed and I didn't have the energy for a confrontation, but I did not hold her hand back. I just let my fingers lie there while she talked, and I listened, and I thought, on day 9, I was discharged. Ray drove me home because I'd asked him to, which I think surprised him. My mother had offered, but I'd said I had it handled. She left the hospital looking wounded, which I noted and filed away. In the car, Ray and I didn't talk much. He had a used Subaru, 10 years old, very clean. There was a travel mug in the cup holder that said Portland Marathon 2019 on it, which I found oddly comforting, the idea of someone who ran marathons. He had music on low, something instrumental that I didn't recognize but liked. When he pulled up outside my apartment building, he turned off the engine and we sat for a moment. "I have a lot of questions," I said. "I know," he said. "I'll answer all of them whenever you're ready, however many times you need to ask them." He gave me his number. He waited until I was inside the building before he drove away. I watched from the lobby window as the Subaru turned the corner and disappeared. I went upstairs. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at my phone for a long time. Then I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring, that eager, slightly anxious pickup of someone waiting. I told her that I loved her because I do, I think, in the complicated way you love someone who shaped you and also failed you. I told her that I needed some time and space and that I was changing my emergency contact. I told her that I was also going to stop paying the electric bill and the truck insurance. I told her these things in a calm voice, not angry, not crying, just clear, like I was reading from a list I'd been making in my head for a very long time. She said, "What? You can't just... What about Garrett? What about Flynn's?" I said, "I love you, Mom. I'll talk to you soon." And I hung up. Flynn texted me an hour later. The text said, "Mom says being dramatic, lol." I did not respond. I turned my phone over, screen down on the table, and I drank my tea. That was 7 months ago. Here's where things stand now. I work the same billing job, but I've said no to every overtime request since I got out of the hospital. My hands don't shake anymore. I sleep 8 hours, which feels sinful and correct all at once. I've filled my prescriptions on time, both pills every day like a person who respects her own body, which is a genuinely new experience. I have dinner with Ray on the second Sunday of every month at the Greek diner 2 blocks from the hospital where I spent 9 days staring at ceiling tiles. We are figuring out what we are to each other, which is something I never thought I'd be doing at 28, but which turns out to be one of the stranger and more worthwhile projects of my recent life. He is quiet in the way of someone who has a lot going on underneath, which I understand because I am also that kind of person. He laughs at his own jokes slightly too early before the punchline, which I find endearing in a way I did not expect. He brought Pepper, his current dog also named Pepper, a tradition apparently, to our third dinner, and Pepper sat under the table and put her head on my shoe for the entire meal, and I thought, okay, my mother has called 17 times. I've picked up 4 of those calls. The conversations have been short and careful, like walking across ice, both of us watching where we step. She has not apologized in any concrete way. She has said things like, "I did what I thought was best, and you have to understand how hard things were," and I have listened and I have said, "I know, Mom, because that's what I have for now, and I think it might be what I have for a while." Flynn texted again last month. He needs help with his car insurance. He said it nicely, which is not something he always does, and I spent a full 20 minutes composing a text that said no in the kindest possible way, which is more effort than the situation deserved, but I sent it and I felt something unfamiliar afterward. I think the unfamiliar feeling was relief. Here is the thing about carrying weight for so long, you forget that your shoulders are supposed to be somewhere lower than your ears. You forget that tired is not the same as normal. You forget that somebody coming to sit with you quietly in a hospital room and bringing you soup from a Greek diner is not an extraordinary thing. Or it is extraordinary. It is the most extraordinary thing, but it shouldn't be. It should not be astonishing that someone who cares about you shows up, but it was astonishing to me. It still kind of is. I have 42 ceiling tiles permanently memorized. I have the number of a man I'm learning to call my father saved in my phone under his name, because that's as far as I've gotten, and that's okay. I have a medication I take every day at 8 a.m., both pills. I have a job I leave on time. And some nights I sit in my apartment and I think about that break room floor and the dirty linoleum, and I think about how a body knows. Eventually. A body knows when it's been asked to do too much, and it puts things down whether you're ready or not. I'm glad mine did. I'm glad it put me on that floor, and in that ICU, and in a room where a stranger with a Subaru and a dog named Pepper could find me. That's where the actual story starts, on the floor, looking up. I think about cause and effect a lot more than I used to. Not in any mystical way, just the plain mechanical version. The thing you do produces the thing that follows, and the thing you don't do produces something too, something quieter, something that accumulates without announcing itself. My mother made choices. Small ones mostly, that didn't look like choices at the time. She chose not to tell me about Ray. She chose to let me believe that the shape of our family was the only shape available. She chose, every time I sent a payment or covered a bill, to receive it without asking whether I was okay underneath the transaction. None of those choices felt dramatic, I'm sure. None of them felt like the kind of decision that would end with her daughter staring at a visitor log in a hospital room, going pale. But they added up. They always add up. And I made choices too. I chose for years to believe that keeping them financially comfortable was the same as being loved by them. I chose to work until my body physically stopped me because stopping on my own felt selfish. I chose silence about how exhausted I was because I had learned somewhere along the way that my exhaustion was inconvenient to people who needed me to keep going. Those choices had consequences too. They just looked like an ICU bed and 42 ceiling tiles and 18 hours of unconsciousness on a Tuesday. Here's what I've come to understand, slowly, the way you understand things that take a long time to become clear. Integrity isn't a dramatic thing. It's not a speech you give or a line you draw in some heated moment. It's 100 small decisions about what you're willing to call the truth, about what you're willing to carry and what you're not, about whether you tell a young person who has a right to know that Ray exists, or whether you decide your own comfort matters more than their understanding of who they are. My mother is not a villain. I need to say that clearly because the easiest version of this story makes her one, and the easy version isn't the true version. She is a person who made choices that served her own fear, her own sense of what was tidier and simpler and less complicated. A lot of people do that. A lot of people call it protecting their kids, and sometimes they even believe it. But I think real protection looks like Ray sitting in a plastic waiting room chair for 4 nights before I even knew he was there. I think it looks like soup from a Greek diner and a travel mug from a marathon and a dog named Pepper who put her head on my shoe. Real protection is someone deciding that your well-being matters even when it costs them something. Time, comfort, the risk of being turned away. The strength I'm still building, the kind I didn't have when I was covering everyone else's bills, is the strength to let that in. To believe that I'm worth showing up for. That's harder than it sounds when you've spent years being the one who shows up for everyone else and never quite expected the same in return. Flynn texted me again last week. I read the message and I set my phone down and I finished my coffee. That was enough. That was the whole response. I'm learning that no is a complete sentence. I'm learning that someone arriving quietly in the dark with soup is more love than 100 grand gestures from people who were somewhere warm while you counted ceiling tiles alone. I'm learning that the truth, even when it arrives late and complicated, is still better than the comfortable story that was keeping you from knowing yourself. My name is in a visitor log somewhere. Ray's name is in it too, 6 times. That record exists. That's what happened. Whatever else changes or doesn't change, that part is true, and I'm building the rest of my life from there.